After World War II, the Swiss International style, also known as International Typographic Style, really revolutionized graphic design. It was the students of Switzerland's answer to Bauhaus, and they really began to experiment with typography and photo montage. In 1918, Ernst Keller of the Zurich School of Arts and Crafts created a model that would become the core of the Swiss school's experiments. And it's characterized by this rigid grid system, structured layout, and unjustified type. Keller's approach determined the essential tenets of contemporary typography. So when you think of the style, Swiss International style, you should think of mathematical grid, sans serif typeface, especially Helvetica, which is the movie that we saw all about Helvetica, and black and white photography. Sorry, go back to a second. So this was really a belief that there was an absolute or universal style in design that should be perfected. And the goal above everything else was to communicate. So there was a lot of new techniques developed in photo typesetting, photo montage, and experimental type. And this movement was also influenced by many other movements, constructivism, for example. And really, the idea behind it was that a designer should strive for readability and objectivity. And so in this style, you'll see a lot of kind of asymmetric layouts. There's almost always use of the grid, sans serif typeface. Sometimes there's flush right and ragged right text. And there can be illustrations, like in these examples, but often there's photography, which we're going to look at in a few minutes. So you can see that this design here is really based on a 3-column grid. So there's 3 columns. All of the text is being laid out in one of those columns. So here's some examples of photography being used. You can see the black and white imagery collaged in with the text and the illustrations. And they chose Helvetica as their typeface because it was very neutral, it had great clarity, and they felt that it had no intrinsic meaning in its form. So the idea being a designer should really be neutral. They should not have an opinion. They should look at the goal of the design and try to communicate that goal. And so this style made it possible for designers to follow a system, and by following that system, they would ensure that they had legibility, cleanliness, objectivity, and this system required them to think about placement and the grid structure. Typography, this is really innovative in the sense that typography was really considered a primary design element. And, you know, in other movements, we've seen this occur where typography became shape, became form. But in Swiss style, there was no distinction between type and graphic. Type was always part of the layout, part of the design. It was never just slopped in there or placed in there in an empty space. It was thought about in terms of how the type interacted with the graphic. This style actually, or this methodology philosophy, makes it easier to design with blocks of text, paragraphs of text. Because when you use a grid, it's much easier for you to kind of figure out where you want to place this information. There was always also a visual hierarchy in place. So Swiss designers thought about what should be read first, second, third. Everything needed to be legible, but some elements were given priority over others. So this idea of visual hierarchy really became important in this movement. And you can see it here. This is just simple text with a few lines, but you can see the visual hierarchy in the sense of what you're supposed to be reading first, second, and then third. Color was used in the designs, but it was often very well thought out. This, for example, is a CMYK color scheme. And the idea was color should be used sparingly. It should be always communicating something so that you're following the methodology of all the elements are important. All the elements are striving to communicate something. And there was a lot of simplicity. And in this simplicity, the harmony and the negative positive relationship really became powerful. So here's another example of kind of using text, using black and white imagery. There was also really innovative composition. And so when you look at Swiss design, you'll notice that the compositions are almost always interesting. So the photos placed into the designs are not boring, bland photos. There's a real thought process to how to put them into the frame. Sometimes they purposely would push things out of the frame and it would go to the edge or bleed to the very edge. And sometimes this style, you can see that, for example, in this example, there's a sense of movement, a sense of energy. Okay, so here's another example of very prominent grid usage here. You see that the text up here, visual hierarchy, this text is being read first, then you go down here, it's lining up precisely with the text at the bottom here. The B, if you were to draw a line, would match this text down here exactly. And then there's a relationship going on with this line and the elements over here, which are kind of being placed on the other side of the page to kind of pull focus. So there's great balance in this design. There's also visual hierarchy, and there's a thought to placement of every element. So Armin Hoffman, there's a few really important designers that were part of this movement. Armin Hoffman is one of them. He taught at the Basel School of Design, and he thought that one of the most efficient means of communication was the poster. So he did these amazing poster designs, and his imagery is always kind of dynamic. I really enjoy his black and white imagery. And just notice the composition of the energy. The figure is really interacting with the graphic, with the text. There's a lot of harmony. A beautiful photo, the ballerina, she's kind of blurred out. So you can see this black and white photography really being used here, and the visual hierarchy of the text and the placement of the text on the grid. Simple color scheme, just red text here, and beautiful use of positive negative space. And this is really kind of interesting because it's dealing with perspective. And, you know, the color scheme is very simple. There's black and white to create the contrast. There's a grid system in place. This is Herbert Matter. We talked about him a little bit before, but he was really an amazing designer and often experimented with scale. And he was part of this design movement. And I really enjoy his use of scale and his placement and the sense of depth and kind of the energy that he put into his work. Here's another one. He would often, you know, just create this incredible energy with these kind of enormous scale increases. And then he would put elements in there that were tiny, so it really gives you this sense of the space and the depth. Joseph Müller-Brockmann, he's really important in this Swiss design movement, and we're going to have a whole kind of lecture about him later on in the semester. And he was born and raised in Switzerland, and he taught at the Zurich School for the Arts. And he created this whole system with the grid. And he wrote an amazing book about grid-based design. And you can see in his designs how precise they were. And he was really a purist in terms of the Swiss movement. He thought that all design should be completely objective. You should take your own opinions out of it. The goal should be clarity. It should be really legibility, objectivity. So Swiss design did kind of change a little bit as it kind of went through the years. It started to become more, a little bit more, less, well, a little less structured in a sense. There was more imagery brought in. So it changed and morphed. But what Swiss design did for modern graphic design is it really put this system in place that's still used today. And it made it so that a real educational model could be used when you teach graphic design. And we know that there are lots of designers that don't follow the Swiss design movement ideals. And we're going to look at one in particular, David Carson, in a few weeks. But it's this system that makes it easier for us as designers. And when you look at design today, really think about what are they doing? Are they using a grid? How is their compositions with their photography? Color scheme. What is the color scheme? And you can see that there is a lot of reference to this movement in the methodology of how a designer works. I put this one in here. It's not really typical Swiss design colors. There's still definitely a grid being used in this layout, but you can see that this is kind of an example of atypical Swiss design. Another one. You can see that there's, this one's kind of more energetic. There's a lot more going on. There's not as much negative space. Whereas this is kind of just, stereotypical Swiss design where they're really starting to get into some innovative typographic layout, using a grid, thinking about visual hierarchy. And this is a poster. And do you remember those Art Nouveau posters we were looking at? This poster was designed after the Swiss design movement. And you can see that there's a kind of a shift in the way the designer approached the typographic layout. So in Art Nouveau, for example, the type would be really organic. It might be flowing throughout the space. In this example, the type is very precise. It's placed on a grid, it's aligned, and the legibility of the type is a priority. Bradbury Thompson was a really influential designer because he had an incredible sense of typographic layout. His use of color, type, and photography is pretty amazing. He was an art director at Mademoiselle magazine, and he designed actually some of the U.S. postage stamps. And he was, really part of this movement and kind of embraced it. He became a faculty member at Yale University, and he invented this alphabet called Alphabet 26, where the uppercase and lowercase letters are identical. And what I really appreciate about him is his amazing use of type. And for example, in this one, to show the water getting deeper, he increases the leading of the text. And then you can also see that he's using this fishing rod as a line of text, and he's using scale, and he's being really playful with his graphics and his imagery. And, he sometimes would do rag right or rag left or left justified or both, left justified and right justified. But he just had this amazing ability to use the type as a graphical element. He's actually one of my personal favorite designers. Let's see some more of his work. But he's following these Swiss principles with his typographic layout. He often would use CMYK colors in his designs. Lester Beale is another designer that's interesting to look at. He did a lot of designs for this magazine called Scope Magazine. And what he's kind of known for is really thinking of type as art. And he really embraced technology in his work. He often would use kind of a clear, concise use of typography, bold primary colors, and he would kind of collage and lay graphics and imagery on top of each other, bringing in the typographic elements, always considering the typographic elements and kind of using them in a graphical way. Type becoming becoming the image. He also, would often bring in kind of these cultural references, and you should really take a look at Scope Magazine. There's some amazing design work that was done. Paul Rand is another designer to look at, and he did a lot of corporate art as well as innovative design. And he was one of the first American designers to really embrace Swiss design. He was an art designer, an art director, and a graphic designer. And he's actually best known for his corporate logo design. He designed for IBM and ABC, but he also did this really kind of innovative design where he would almost make it look like hand-done type. And he would place it kind of in this kind of cut and paste methodology. Here's another one where he's kind of bringing in this texture, hand-drawn type. So he was very experimental. I think the scope of his work is really amazing. When you look at his corporate work, when you look at the IBM logo, you look at this kind of innovative, more free, innovative design that he did, you can see how complete he was as a designer and how much experimentation he did. This is the Westinghouse logo that he designed. Oops. Then there's Milton Glaser, which we kind of talked about in an earlier lecture. He was the founder of Pushpin Studios. And he had this amazing style where he kind of combined Victorian art, arts and crafts, Art Deco with contemporary type and illustration. So take a look at more Swiss design. We're going to be kind of going forward, going to be looking at different designers, David Carson, April Greiman, typographic deconstruction, and seeing how types shift into a real experimental phase in the 80s and 90s. But Swiss design is really important. And as a designer, you should understand Swiss design, know the designers that were part of this movement, and you should at some point be working with a grid. You don't always have to work with a grid, but you should understand how to work with a grid and why it's important to work with a grid. So let me know if you have any questions.